Okay, so I was originally going to start this video with a joke about how quick the turnaround between this video and the last Elancia one was, but then it took me 5 months to finish the script because, imagine it, being a college student does take up 90% of your time. But anyway, welcome back to Kit Info Dumps about stupid furry bullshit, and yes, I am somehow even more obsessed with these books than I was when I made the first video. If you missed that one, which you probably did because the YouTube algorithm hates me, check it out via the link in the top right corner or the description. But, in short, Leilani Wilson, a really cool composer who made music for all these games, made a series of fantasy western novels and concept albums called Elancia Chronicles. These books follow the adventures of Verse, a Transfem former pirate, as she journeys across Elancia with her friends Himbro, Autism Bat, Mount Butch, and the Holy Knight of Compet to fight oppressive regimes, assorted gods, and Verse's gender dysphoria. I've already done a video discussing the first book, Symphony of Shifting Tides, and this video will be tackling the second, Symphony of Hunted Truths. There will be some minor spoilers for the events of the first book through this video, in order to contextualize what I talk about, but we won't get into detailed spoilers until the dedicated spoiler section. However, before we get to that, there are a few things we need to address. Firstly, I finally have a new PNGtuber for my persona, Stormy. This art was done by Leilani's partner Emma, who's actually a co-writer on books 3 and 4 of Elancia. I'm honestly so jazzed with how it turned out. Her art style fits Stormy incredibly well, and now I have a decent range of emotions across these stills for her, so expect to see her a lot more frequently throughout future videos and live streams. Back on the subject of Elancia, I feel it's important to acknowledge that I have now not only read all of the released books, whereas I'd only read through the first one when I read the previous video, but I've also read the in-progress first draft of Book 4, courtesy of Layla. This is all in addition to chatting with her frequently about the creation of the books and just generally hyperfixating on them longer than I have for anything else. I'm going to attempt to not let this affect my critique of the book, but there will almost certainly be some unintentional bias in this review. Admittedly, in my first video, I think I was a little bit overexcited to be working directly with Layla, since that's not really an opportunity I've had with a creator before, and I unintentionally ignored a lot of that book's flaws in the video as a result. But then again, an unbiased review isn't exactly a thing that exists, since everyone brings their own personal experiences to their interpretations of media. In any case, I'll be trying to be a bit more thorough with this review, especially given how long it's taken to finish up. Last thing before we get into actually talking about Hunted Truths, I do have an incredibly exciting update regarding the availability of the Elancia series. Over the past few months, Layla and Emma have been working on overhauling the first book for an eventual re-release, and as of November 2024, the books are officially going to be returning to print in 2025. Incredibly massive thanks to Transcendent Fiction Publishing, which is just an incredible pun. I mean, TF Publishing? If you're a furry, you almost certainly know what that means, and if you don't, well, get the fuck out. Please leave while you still can! But seriously, it makes me so incredibly happy to see the books getting published again. This is genuinely probably my favorite book series, period, and I'm so happy to see it find a new audience, and hopefully, once the re-releases are done, see Layla's narrative unfold in the way she's worked so hard to make happen. Because having read most of the Book 1 rewrite, as well as the first draft of Book 4, you all are not ready for what's coming. Be sure to follow TF Publishing, Leilani, and me on Bluesky for more updates on the specifics as soon as they're announced. I'd also highly recommend joining the Elancia Chronicles and Hardspeed Discord server I've linked down in the pinned comment and the description, as we talk about some incredibly fun stuff in there. And we absolutely love to listen to new readers' reactions to the books. But finally, since I don't have to get into the lengthy 10-minute backstory of how I discovered Elancia this time, we can jump straight into the discussion, and hopefully get this video done a bit more quickly than the previous one. The fact that this book is only about half as long as the first will also help in this regard. There's actually a bit of an interesting story in regards to why it's that short though. See, according to Leilani, books 2 and 3 were originally meant to be published as one single book. However, the book's original publisher, Gull Publications, wanted shorter novels, as the first book was almost 500 pages in length. So they asked for Leilani to split what would have been Awakened Gods in two. The point where they suggested she split the novels was far earlier in the book than she'd originally expected, which forced her to add a lot to the first half retroactively in order to make it feel like a complete story. Because of this, Hunted Truths is a bit of an outlier in the Elancia series, and has a very different vibe overall. This book is almost a Verse solo adventure as she scours her homeland of Kurlenzia to discover the whereabouts of her sister Lyricos and get the answers hidden away by her missing memories. Many of the other major characters we followed have significantly reduced roles in this novel, or are completely absent. Cecilia and Basil do not appear in this book at all, and were it less well written, I would bemoan the absence of my stupid little creature. Karina doesn't show up until the very end of this book, and Zan is the only other member of the Basker Five to play a major part in this story, with him still not showing up until about halfway through. Now, you might think this takes a lot of enjoyment out of the novel, cutting us off from the characters we grew attached to in the previous book. However, I think giving us this opportunity to focus on Verse's character arc is an incredibly smart move, as she's very much the emotional core of the series, and we see almost everything from her perspective. Especially given this whole arc in Kerlensia is when Verse finally becomes a more complete and whole person, accepting her past and who she is. Leilani has described the early parts of the series as a stealth western, with the Wild Arms series being one of her biggest inspirations, and you can definitely feel that in the first half of this book. It's lonely, but in an introspective way that makes the narrative feel incredibly focused. However, that's not to say that this book doesn't have other compelling characters. In fact, it introduces a few who will become major players in the rest of the series, with some of them being personal favorites of mine. Case in point, this is Montelius Malroni, though he prefers to go by Fiend. This dragonkin is introduced as a thieving mercenary who steals the one-of-a-kind weapons of Verse's parents from their abandoned home, and much of the novel sees Verse attempting to track him down and get them back. Fiend here is a wanted man from up on the frontier, north of the Kerlensian Empire, and it's a good old western yeehaw country up there, so Fiend here talks with a good bit of that stereotypical cowboy accent. As a born and raised Wyoming girl, I'd almost be proud of the representation if I didn't hate Wyoming so much. While this book is somewhat light on outright villains, Fiend is the most recurring antagonistic figure here, and he's extremely entertaining basically every time he shows up. Fiend is more important to the later books than this one, but he still has some really fun scenes here. His full dragon buddy Narg is far more important to this book though, and without spoiling too much, he's how we get a few insights into Fiend's true goals, motivations, and a little bit of his personal history. Narg has known Fiend since he was hatched, and is the only person Fiend will truly let his guard down around. They almost always show up as a pair, and given that Narg is one of the few full-blooded dragons even known to exist, it makes them both a threatening force to be reckoned with. Another character who makes his first appearance in this book is a shadowy wolf who goes by the name of Jericho, after the long-dead god of shadows. This mysterious adventurer crosses paths with Verse at multiple points throughout the story, and he's very much the quiet type, doesn't often speak, and even when he does, it's soft and almost distant. He has a solemn air about him, but for reasons unknown to Verse, he always seems to pop up whenever she's in danger. These two characters are the new additions who will be most relevant to the narrative going forward, as, though there are a few other characters introduced here, their roles are much more minor. However, Fiend and Jericho are major characters who will get more deeply fleshed out throughout the next few books, and in this one particularly, they have a really fun dynamic in their introductory scene that I wanted to showcase. "You got two options, Chief," said the dragonkin, past the barrels of his guns. "You let me walk out of here with the loot, or I make you let me. You're outgunned." The wolf sighed, one of his ears flicking.
"This is a terrible mistake. You should reconsider."
"I don't see nothing about this that looks like a mistake," the dragonkin laughed. "Old Nark here can bite your head off, and ain't nobody gonna come down here to find the rest of you." The wolf must have rolled his eyes. Verse couldn't see his face, because the dragonkin bared his fangs. "You ain't in a situation to mock me, pal." The wolf finally spoke.
"You're assuming many things, Mr. Malroni."
The particular setting of this book also brings its own host of new characters in the form of the Imperial Knights of Kerlensia. Verse's history in the Empire wasn't exactly the most peaceful thing in the world, as she was forced to join the Knights as a teenager, one of the only things she remembers about her past in the first book. However, in order to leave for Basker, she abandoned her post with them, making her a wanted woman. So, naturally, when she returns to Kerlensia, she's eventually tracked down and forced to rejoin the Knights, who also thankfully happen to be looking for Lyricos, or, as they know her, Lady Kirill Hamana of the Hulia Prefecture. Alongside Verse are the other members of Squad F. First, and most unfortunately, there's Captain Wall Stones. This guy is fucking awful. He's a haughty, pompous asshole who looks down on his squad as a massive bigot and is generally just a teenage nepo baby who doesn't deserve his position by any stretch of the imagination. Thankfully, though, Verse and many of the other characters take basically every opportunity they can find to mock him and make it clear just how much of a stupid little piss baby he is. There's also Sykes Atherton, another foxkin, who until recently worked training non-sentient animals to track for the Knights, before being reassigned to the investigation division. Loxley, the last fox he trained, also joins their squad as resident stinky boy and comic relief. Atherton is a sarcastic but relatively chill person, and he's one of the only people Verse is able to let her guard down around in this book, even if it's just a little bit. They end up being sparring partners a couple of times in the story, and have a really fun dynamic whenever they're in a scene together. Finally, we have our last two members of Squad F, Urella Luen and Erudos Cray. Luen is a pandakin who serves as the team's weapons expert. She's very much the peacekeeper of the group, and often sets aside her own feelings on the issues they face if it means the conflict won't escalate. She also tends to be the one who keeps the group on track when Wall is being irresponsible. Cray, meanwhile, is a very soft-spoken tigerkin, recently demoted from his position in the Silence Division. He's a bit of an oddball, but he takes his job incredibly seriously, being the most strict about keeping the others in line with what's expected of the Knights. He also has one of the absolute coolest fighting styles in the series, for sure, with his... I'm not actually sure what the hell these weapons are called beyond claws, but I keep seeing them pop up in a bunch of the media I consume, and I don't know, they've always just stuck out to me as super cool. Cray has them here, Jenica has them in TMNT, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. As I said earlier, this book takes place in Verse and Karina's home nation of Kurlenzia, a nation inspired by various Asian cultures that's currently undergoing a major political shift. The current empress is a child, being barely able to rule with the help of her advisors and the lords of the empire's various prefectures. Many of these folks, of course, also have their own selfish goals, leading them to try and sway the country's rule in one way or another. Additionally, in the past few decades, Kurlenzia has been undergoing a slow process of alienization, with their old traditions and beliefs being altered or outright banned, magic being outlawed, and an increased cracking down on those with non-conformative identities. And that's not even touching on the growing tensions between the two halves of the country, with classism toward the stupid hicks of the East and haughty nobles of the West. Because both this book and Awakened Gods take place primarily in Kurlenzia, it leads to this particular nation being incredibly well fleshed out in terms of its history, current state, and the types of characters that play a part in its narrative. While I liked Decilia and Celestian in the previous book, much of the lore established there was more so focused on the Elians and the Aegeus, rather than the countries themselves, and while those religious groups have an effect on this book's plot, everything that happens is distinctly Kurlenzian, compared to how those two nations were essentially a proxy battleground. However, because of this new setting, and with the events of the previous book, the few returning characters who are involved have some incredibly interesting arcs that follow them through this one. We also get a lot more lore on the larger world of Elancia, particularly in regards to the Sky Ring, a massive structure of some kind permanently suspended in the upper atmosphere of Elancia. Occasionally, pieces of the Sky Ring will break off and come crashing down to the ground, making a massive impact, both figuratively and literally, wherever they land. These pieces of star junk often appear to be entire buildings or other structures full of advanced technology, which junkers attempt to make a living by salvaging. Sometimes, this technology survives the crash and remains fully functional, with robots of various sizes and purposes now finding themselves on Elancia's surface, most of the time acting as a threat to our heroes. This sort of expansion really accelerates the genre bending I mentioned in the previous video, and helps Elancia's world to feel truly unique amongst its contemporaries. Aside from the actual story material, the cover art was once again handled by Nightline Z, still being fairly inaccurate to the novels themselves, but due to the fact that there's a grand total of one character this time around, it's not nearly as egregious as the previous one. He also handled one of the interior illustrations for the novel, which was actually intended as the original cover, before it was outright rejected by Layla. The rest of the interior art is still handled by Renz, whose illustrations this time around are significantly more consistent and polished overall. Apparently, the reason the style was so inconsistent throughout the first book was due to him rushing to update as much of the art as he could before the books were printed, but not being able to get to all of them in time. In this book, the only art styles present are the detailed, shaded one for most of the novel, and toward the end it switches to flat line work. From what I could gather, this shift was mostly due to Renz not being particularly happy with the way the more detailed illustrations showed up in the printed books. And as a result, this is the only style used for the rest of the series. Also, while we're here, major thanks to Renz, Raranoazoa, aka Harriet, and Layla for helping to dig up the old color versions of every illustration from books 1 and 2. It's been a massive help in making this video more visually interesting compared to the previous one, and also just, a big advancement for the preservation of the series. And of course, given Layla's career as a composer, this book has to come alongside its own album. It's far shorter than the previous one in the series, but then again, holy shit, I don't know how she made over 100 songs for that album in the first place. Hunted Truths is still pretty long, featuring around 45 tracks, and I personally believe the overall quality of them is much higher here. Patchmore's theme, Illusionist, and both variants of Jericho's theme, Penumbra Debonair, are some of the best songs in the entire series, while the many variants of Never Stay the Same and Curlinzia Field add an incredible atmosphere to the locations they represent. Curlinzia Field's South Night is particularly a top 3 contender for my favorite Elancia track, period. Here's a few brief samples of some of my favorite tracks. Finally, before we get into the spoiler section, one last thing that I'm sure you've all been waiting for. Welcome to the second and final edition of Verse Egg Moments, where we call out Verse for saying and doing extremely normal cis-man behavior, and pick on her because we love this stupid little mess. We could probably extend this into the first half or so of the next book, but given Verse has finally accepted who she is in her own inner monologue by the end of this one, I felt it more appropriate to end it off here. So, without further ado, we'll be picking up the count from exactly where we left off last time. So, Verse spotted a blank piece of paper. With one of the pens, he added his wish to the pile.
Please, goddess, make me a girl.
Young Verse liking to play princesses with her friends. Verse getting mistaken for a woman numerous times throughout the book and just rolling with it.
Well, what's your name?
She asked. Verse bit his lip.
Mary Sue.
Mary Sue what?
Just Mary Sue. I'm a lieutenant. I would not let him take any dreams from me, nor me freedom. I'm a woman, I told him, glaring at him. I dared him to say something about it, but he didn't. Exactly.
I think Verse meant Kirill. She's just tired.
He, Craig corrected Atherton. Verse coughed. He hadn't really felt great about that exchange. Still, it did little to distract him from the oddness of it all.
Settle, princess,
Jericho said a few moments later.
Princess?
Verse asked with a growl.
Princess Periwinkle was perhaps not your best, Elias,
said the wolf, who was already making his way back to shore.
How do you know about that, Alice? That was a secret.
Your wanted posters, before they were taken down,
said Jericho.
You act like a spoiled princess somewhat. Therefore you must be one.
Still thinking about all that, even after waking up. It would be nice if I could just somehow magically become normal. Just a normal girl. Wouldn't that be nice? I value my freedom, but that freedom makes me weird. I could have been normal, maybe. I could have tried really hard to do the man thing. I keep trying, I really do. I have to, right? That's how I was born. That's how I look. This is just stupid fantasy. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Lyricos is gone now. I don't really get to be me anymore. Instead, I'm this. What do you call it when you're a girl on the inside? I guess I'm the only one. Maybe I should make up a word.
I am playing Vrasak, who is human.
Patchmore reminded her.
It's a play. You've got all sorts of people playing all sorts of roles, genders, races, it doesn't matter. Your performance matters.
I don't know much about the month, but I know how to play the flute.
You carry yourself with poise and grace when you're not trying to act macho. You've an elegance to you, even your laugh. What more would a goddess need?
thought Verse.
Nothing, I guess.
You were perfect.
Said Patchmore, patting the fox on the back.
Would you like to keep the dress?
Verse blushed.
Don't you need it?
Patchmore made a shooing gesture.
Consider it payment.
He said with a little smile. Also, for consistency's sake, the word fuck is said 109 times in this book, which is about 80-ish less than the first one, but when you take into consideration the fuck to page ratio of each book, the first one still has more. This is likely due to the fact that Zan doesn't show up till like halfway through book 2. And now we're at that point in the video where I'm gonna need to spoil the hell out of it to get my thoughts across, so if you haven't read it yet, definitely skip this section and come back when you have. And while you're at it, be sure to drop a like on the video and comment down below to give it a boost in the bane of my existence, the YouTube algorithm. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the eventual Awakened Gods video, which will feature an interview with Leilani herself about the creation of the series. I also have my own personal Discord linked in the description if you want to keep up with the channel and chat with me, in addition to the official Elancia and Heartspeed Discord server. Anyway, back to Elancia. Spoilers start in 3, 2, 1. Fair warning, this is like the third time I've tried to rewrite the spoiler section into a more condensed form, because both times it's just ended up basically being a recap of the book, which is the last thing I want it to be. But anyway, I guess we can go ahead and start with Verse's backstory, which, while not being fully spelled out, is incredibly tantalizing with the bits of info we are given. Verse being directly involved in the apparent deaths of both her parents, but still being unable to put the pieces together due to the gaps in her memory, makes delving straight into more backstory at the beginning of the book an incredibly bold choice, but one that immediately grips the reader, and found me hooked on this book even more than I was with Shifting Tides. It also just goes to show how much of a little tyrant Verse was as a child, as well as delving into her relation with her closest childhood friend, Camden, and much more. If you thought Verse was traumatized in book 1, you ain't seen nothing yet. But hey, at least we have a fun little mention of Capel's name, the protagonist of Layla's other major passion project, Heartspeed. Perhaps the biggest strength this exploration of Verse's backstory has is the fact that, essentially, by the end of this book, you have almost all of the pieces to put it completely together. So it makes it incredibly fun to theorize what's actually going on throughout this book, and come closer and closer to the truth before it's revealed in Awakened Gods. Verse's memories returning to her slowly but surely throughout this book is incredibly satisfying to watch unfold, even as it seriously messes with Verse's mental state. Another aspect of Verse's character that is incredibly enjoyable throughout this book is her dreams, though not in the way you might think. You may recall that at the end of the last book, Verse and Lyricos' dream connection was severed, which is part of why it's been made so difficult for Verse to track her down. But the reason that's happening in the first place is because, now that she has the Eye of Fate, almost all of Verse's dreams are visions of the future. For this book, it's one vision in particular, slightly different every time, yet just as haunting all the same. Verse in the ruins of a hilly city, the bodies of civilians and her friends scattered around her, with one thing abundantly clear: she had killed them all. Fate, or as he reveals his true name to be, Ares, often appears to taunt Verse in these dreams, toying with her and attempting to use her to further his own agenda. Verse comes pretty close to trusting him at a few points and struggles not to fall for his manipulation. Their dynamic here is an incredibly interesting change of pace from the Lyricos dreams in the first book, showing an entirely different side of Verse, while still exploring her character in an incredibly personal way. And that final dream where she speaks with a supposed future version of herself, the one who did all of those terrible things, genuinely just one of the best scenes in the entire series. And something Layla pointed out to me is that this future Verse's plan is actually identical to what Fate mentions in the first book. When Zan is finally reintroduced, it admittedly feels like a bit of a detour, as he participates in a local competition before the upcoming Festival of Storms, where Verse has promised to meet him. But who cares if it's a detour, because Patchmore is back! Let's fucking go! The legend who transcends all sexuality, the most sexy cat this side of Elancia, and he has tiger stripes now? Oh. Anyway, it does take Zan a while to get caught back up into the rest of the narrative, but once he is finally reunited with Verse, their dynamic and growth is so fun to watch. Zan, rightfully, holds a pretty big grudge against Verse for abandoning him once they'd reached Kerlinzia, and it echoes what happened with the two of them back on Basker, with Verse refusing to go alongside Zan to fight in the war. This forces Verse to really grapple with why she does this to herself, isolating herself out of fear that one day, every friend she has will abandon her. But through it all, their friendship comes out stronger in the end, and the journey to get there is incredibly captivating. Moving on to Fiend, one of the best things about his antagonistic relationship with Verse in this book is that it leads to some of the most fun banter in the series. A favorite moment of mine is early in the book, when Verse is tracked down by Squad F prior to her forced re-enlistment, and to buy herself some time, she breaks into Fiend's room at the hotel she tracked him to. She locks herself in, and demands he return her gun while loudly saying his name to alert the Knights that such a wanted man was here, distracting them. And upon skimming through the book again for this video, Fiend and Jericho do end up interacting a lot more than I remembered. They have a fantastic scene that's incredibly revealing for both of their characters, with Fiend's headstrong nature getting the better of him, as he had seemingly been hired to kill Jericho, yet ignores the wrath of Kirill, aka Lyricos, and her allies that would bring on him.
You realize your attempt on my life would mean Elise and the others would want to kill you.
Would? Asked Fiend. I'm pretty sure you've already sent all your cronies after me anyway. Jericho just shook his head.
No one knows what you did, except your 2 headhunter friends, and they are known liars. As far as the guild is concerned, it was an accident.
Fiend's eyes widen. That don't make a lick of sense. This some kind of trick?
I've done this out of respect for Narg, not out of respect for you,
said Jericho.
Keep that in mind if you make a second attempt.
Fiend made a sound, but then just sighed. I don't get you. You're in with Carol, aren't you? She's got you watching over that Fox girl, huh? How much did she pay you? Was your soul worth it? First Narg, now you? Is this whole guild spineless? Half of you are working for Carol, and the other half are working for...
Bernard?
Jericho asked. Fiend straightened his hat out on his head. Yeah. And also early in the book, there's a brief mention of Fiend having some strange sort of bandages around his chest. I wonder what that could possibly mean. On the subject of Jericho, we're eventually told that his goals are the same as Verse's, to find Lyricos. As such, their paths cross numerous times, and Verse is almost always forced into an uneasy alliance with the strange wolf. His quiet nature makes it incredibly difficult for Verse to get any information out of him, and the mystery only grows with each detail she does learn. He's worked in organized crime, but his family also owns a hotel. But eventually, we do find out the real reason he's been such a constant presence. He, along with Atherton, and a character who's introduced in the book's last few chapters, Elise, were sent by Lyricos to protect Verse. Now, why is that? Well, that requires a bit more explanation. The book's finale brings Squad F, plus Jericho and Zan, to the Forbidden Library, filled to the brim with star junk. In reality, this is a long-fallen records haul from the Sky Ring. In the epilogue, we learn that the Sky Ring is actually a colony suspended in Elancia's orbit, brought back from the far future by the gods. We'll get more into that later, but for now, I find this final sequence incredibly exciting, as it bounces back and forth between Verse and Lyricos' parties, Verse trying to get to the library past its mechanical defenses, including a giant futuristic tank known only as the Grambler, and Lyricos trying to fight off a member of the Aegeus Pantheon, Torrent, the goddess of winds and the last of the fairies. And with the battle between Torrent and Lyricos, you can really feel the impact that Torrent's godhood has on this fight. It's incredibly brutal. With these events progressing in sync with each other, and constantly bouncing back and forth between the two groups, it really heightens the tension of the chapter in a way I absolutely love, and it tantalizes the reader with even more mysteries about who exactly Lyricos is, and what her role in all of this might be. For example, there are various mortal detectors spread throughout the library. These devices are exactly what they sound like. Gates that determine whether an individual is a mortal or a god, and deny or permit them access to the library accordingly. And while you'd think this might be just an obstacle in our protagonist's way, that's where you'd be wrong, as it actually reveals some information about our characters most of them weren't even aware of. For example, the scanners make a distinction between mortals, scary mortals, and gods. And while the meaning of scary mortal isn't exactly clear at this point in the series, that will become important going into Book 3. Not to mention the fact that it identifies Lyricos as the goddess Shiva, which isn't entirely accurate, but very directly hints toward the nature of Lyricos' heritage. Not to mention the fact that Lyricos' appearance is somewhat different from usual in this chapter, with her having a sharkkin's tail. As for Verse, well...
This is getting strange. Mortal, scary mortal, Chosen? Wonder what stupid name it'll give me. Ha! Is that fucking thing gonna give Verse scary status too? Fucking weak.
Zane grumbled. Verse shrugged grandiosely as ever as he stepped through the gate. Welcome, Goddess Lament, said the voice, and the door opened. Zan and Jericho looked through the doorway, but then the rabbit turned back to Verse, eyes narrowed.
Yo, what?
This scene only further confirms Verse's ties to the water goddess Lament, and presents as a chilling hint of what will finally be revealed in the next book. And the fact that later on, in one of Verse's journal entries where she's laying out her past, present, and future, for the first section she just writes, Welcome Goddess Lament, you can see how deeply this revelation shakes her, even if she doesn't really show it in the moment. But of course, Verse and Lyricos are not reunited yet. Lyricos' battle with Torrent draws her far, far away from the library, with it being impossible for Verse and company to keep up. However, that doesn't mean Verse fails to get any of the answers she was looking for. Elise, a skunkkin, and one of Lyricos' allies, remains behind, giving Verse a lengthy letter from Lyricos. I won't show the whole thing here, for the sake of time, but the fact that Verse finally gets answers to so many of her questions, her age, the fact that she and Lyricos are half-sisters, the fact that her parents might still be alive, that she really can't trust fate, and, most of all, that she should not seek out Lyricos under any circumstances, as it's far too dangerous for her. Surely she'll follow that request. Surely. What do you mean they're both on the cover of the next book? No, that isn't Lyricos. That's And the epilogue of this book? God, Layla just kills it with the epilogues in general. Opening with Verse's diary entry, showing how heartbroken she is after everything that's happened, establishing that she finally recognizes she's a woman, even if she's not really ready to fully come out to anyone else yet. I guess I'm the only one. Oh, Verse. If only you knew how much the trans population of this series would explode after this point. You know what? Fuck it. I think it'd be fun to mess with those of you who've read this far. If you haven't read book 3 yet, well, surprise! There are at least 3 trans characters other than Verse that you've met in the series so far. Hell if I'll tell you who though. You just have to keep reading to find out. But anyway, in the final moments of the novel, the Festival of Storms finally begins, with Verse being talked by Patchmore into participating in their performance. This is how we get the closest thing to a lore dump and actual origin story for the universe of Elancia, detailing how the Beastkin came to be, the formation of the Aegeus Fellowship, Elia's betrayal of the other gods, all with Verse playing the role of Lament. If that isn't the coolest way for us to get this exposition, I don't know what is. Capping it all off with the first true hints of Verse and Karina actually getting together, with them being reunited during the festival and ending up in bed together that night, and then the cliffhanger of the Palace of Storms rising from the ground, becoming a flying fortress. And there is just so much more I wanted to discuss here, but honestly, I kind of want to leave it as a surprise for those who will hopefully read the books for themselves. Gosh, I didn't even get to talk about Narg and his deal with Fiend, and oh my goodness, there's just so much packed into this one book, which is crazy given its shorter length. But that just goes to show how much Layla and the other creatives who've contributed to this project truly care about it, and it makes me so happy to see that the books are finally starting to get recognized for everything they have to offer. Anyway, I think that's a good enough place to cap it off for this video. Sorry it took so long to get this out, I just got really fucking busy and then depressed and then busy again, and it just became a vicious cycle. Honestly hoping to get back to posting here more frequently, but then again, I always say that, so we'll see if that actually ends up happening this time. I'll probably be making at least one more non-Elancia related video between this one and the Awakened Gods one, and I've got way too many extra side projects in the works now, so my spare time is even more non-existent. Once again, I'd like to extend a massive thanks to Layla, Emma, Renz, Harriet, and everyone else who's played a part in feeding my Elancia hyperfixation, as it's honestly been one of the best experiences of my life. Getting to know you all and learn more about your creative processes. I mean, hell, it's the reason my current girlfriend and I are even together. All that said, I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day. Be gay, do crimes, all the usual stuff. And bye-bye now.